Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Futures Talk, Designing for the Future, Utopia, Dystopia, and Demystifying Complexity. My name is Katie Bentbolio, and I am a project manager with New Silk Roads in our Futures Thinking programs. Today, or tonight's Futures Talk, explores one of the foremost challenges in futures thinking, and one that can feel more pressing these past few days, weeks, months than ever. Namely, how can we imagine the future beyond the very real challenges of today? And equally, if not more important, how can we convince others to envision 10, 50, 100 years down the line when they already feel overwhelmed by the present? We could not have a better pair of speakers, a pair of Sherifs, to help us answer this question tonight. So for starters, Sherif El Diwany is an Egyptian-Swiss executive and entrepreneur with 35 years of global experience in economic policy, particularly designing and implementing microeconomic policy reforms. Since returning to Egypt in 2014, Diwany has engaged in public-private dialogue with the Alexandria Business Association on business environment reform and green transformation of the private sector in Egypt. He formerly served as the senior director of the Middle East and North Africa division of the World Economic Forum, and in 2009 was named by Arab Business Magazine as one of the 50 most influential Arabs. He will be joined by Sherif Goubran, an assistant professor of sustainable design in the Department of Architecture at the American University in Cairo. Goubran's research focuses include building sustainability and sustainability assessment, sustainability in architectural design, and human approaches to design. He also leads a group of young researchers called Engage Sustainable Futures, who are conducting interdisciplinary research in design, architecture, building engineering, and real estate finance. Before I turn over the floor to our speakers, a few housekeeping notes. This Futures Talk will start with presentations, followed by a moderated discussion. We will then open the floor to you, our esteemed attendees, for a series of Q&A questions from the audience. We will be collecting questions throughout the talk in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please submit questions at any point during the talk. You don't need to work or wait until the Q&A section. So as soon as an idea comes to your mind, please share. We kindly ask that you phrase your question in the form of a question. And if you'd like, please feel free to include your name, affiliation, location, though this is up to you. And finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded and that we'll be sharing the video publicly online after the talk. The Futures Talk series is co-hosted by New Silk Roads and the AUC Innovation Hub. We've been working together over the past year on several futures thinking initiatives, including a recent Futures Lab in Egypt, exploring the future of the real estate sector and how the sector can participate in the country's green transition. New Silk Roads, a little bit about us. We offer a range of futures thinking programs focused on collectively imagining preferred futures and producing bold and innovative future scenarios. For over 10 years, we've been working with a range of clients, including international organizations, multinational companies, and creative enterprises. We're thrilled to be working with the AUC Innovation Hub, which is a springboard for industry partnerships, multidisciplinary research, and experiential learning. Located at the AUC New Cairo campus, the Innovation Hub offers corporations, startups, and AUC faculty, as well as students, the opportunity to collaborate together on research projects and co-create solutions to Egypt and the region's toughest challenges. Lastly, these Futures Talks are supported by the GreenWorks program, which is led by HIVOS with support from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And now, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Sherif El Diwany. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you for the organizers for this wonderful topic. I actually like the topic for two reasons. I am a person who loves looking into the future, and I'm also an architect. So although I haven't practiced much architecture, it still remains in my DNA. And I think of architecture and urban planning as an important part of our lives because it does shape our lives and shapes our environments. And then talking about the future, I think there is no better time than now. We have all seen how much change we can experience in 2020 when all our lives have been changed. And the depth of change was unimaginable. And I think we all agree now that the type of change that the world is seeing and continues to see is going to be increasingly frequent and more uncertainty will be the name of the game. So what we would, as human beings, what we need to do is to be resilient. Being resilient has to be based on foresight. Hence, the topic is extremely relevant. Future thinking and designing for the future is relevant from my point of view. In that sense, it is quite important that we think about what are the possible futures and have foresight, and then be able to prepare ourselves in different scenarios of what can possibly happen and how can we adapt. And for making future thinking is by default a thinking process, and therefore it depends on the ability of our brains and our imagination and our ability to articulate different futures. Also, we have to remember that we are human, and because we depend on this machine in our head to help us understand what's going around us, and therefore be able to imagine futures and create scenarios in which we get ready through, we have to understand what affects. So what are the three most important things that the science is pointing to that affects the way we think? So the first one, which is my favorite actually, is derived from a book called 1,000 Brains, which talks about how the brain functions, and basically how as we grow up, we build models of what we see and what we experience, and with human beings and environments, and everything around us is recorded in our brain in the shape of a model. And these models basically are 1,000, it's more than 1,000 brains, but the expression of 1,000 brains means that we have so many different models in our brain that we recall these models, and we understand the world around us using those models. Just to simplify, it's very, on a very basic level. The first time we see a coffee cup and we see some smoke coming out of it, we recognize this as a coffee cup because we experience it, and then we record the image in our head. It has smoke coming out, so it's hot. So when I touch it, it's hot, and that becomes the image of a model I built of a coffee cup that stays with me, and then I can experience coffee cups throughout my life, and with their variations within that context, within the model I've built in my brain about coffee cups. The second framework is one that has to do with the way with the way we describe our realities. It's the narratives, the way we relate to the realities around us. And there was a fascinating book by one of the bestsellers, actually, of the last decade, or the current decade rather. Yuval Noah Harari wrote a book called Homo Deus, and he talks about how humanity and society creates stories about everything that everything that except us as human beings are everything that we live in is the reality constructed by us, and by creating narratives around them. And the best example he gives, which if you think about it for a minute, you understand the extent of the importance of the concept of narrative and what it means in the way it shapes on our thinking. Money, the idea of money, is basically a narrative about a piece of paper that people have told us that this paper has value, and that if I give it to Sherif or give it to Katie or Nada, that this will be transferred in value and so on. So we believe the story of money because we've all came around it, and we created this narrative, and therefore we put it to work in very large scale across the earth, across the globe, that we all understand the narrative of money in that sense. And then we have the third and last, is also a quite important one, how our thinking process functions. There's a very well-known book written by a Nobel laureate. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. It describes, his name is Daniel Kahneman, It describes the fact that we have two ways of thinking, one which is very intuitive, quick, fast, rapid reaction to understanding what's happening around us or making decisions about them, and the other one which is a more deliberate, thoughtful. It has effort involved, and obviously by nature we are programmed to go to the path of least resistance, which is thinking fast. So we may make mistakes, and we can produce biased narratives and biased models in that sense of the world that we live in. And therefore, when we start constructing stories about the future, we are anchored in these biases. And what I'd like to propose is to ask my co-speaker, Sherif Goubran, to go ahead and present his presentation, his piece, and then I would like to have it an interactive fashion, because I would see what he has to say, and then I will try to place these models and try to create value for our audience by discussing with him how these three thinking frameworks can affect or can create biases for anyone who wants to use them in creating stories about the future, and then therefore learning from them and becoming resilient. So I stop here, and I'm all ears, Sherif.
Yeah, thank you, Sherif, for that introduction. And I think today, basically, I have a short intervention, maybe. Just I'm thinking on this issue of dystopia and utopias, basically, and how these no places, and we'll get to understand how they're no places, could be used as tools for imagining places, in fact. And the interest here is that for those of you familiar with futurist thinking, this issue of the extremes is usually something that's not usually explored or of interest in futurist thinking. Instead, we're usually interested in more the probable or preferable scenarios, but more to that later. So just to start off, it's always good to start with an understanding of a word. So if we think or look at the word utopia, so this comes from Greek of ou, or not topos, place, right? So it's the no place. So a utopia is a no place. And thinking of utopias, it's certainly important that it comes to mind Sir Thomas More's Utopia. This is a book published by English author Moore in 1516, so more than 500 years ago. I think the full title reads "Of a Republic's Best State and of the New Island Utopia." So in this book, Thomas More overviewed what could be the social, political, customs, and religious even practices of this ideal island. And the idea is that it showed very, very early forms of socialist thinking. At that time, this contradicted the realities of 16th century England. And later on, this approach was named utopian socialism, which was used actually to describe this first concept of socialism. So if you read that short quote, so we see a very socialist view of that island, where they're refusing punishment and instead thinking of providing livelihood, means of livelihood for everyone in order to avoid misbehavings or problems. So it's quite interesting to think that Sir More's imagined and speculative utopia helped to create the foundation for a social political theory, socialism, that was only formalized almost 300 years later. And that leaves us really to think, can speculation lead us to reality? So we'll leave that question maybe lingering in the back of our mind for a moment. But again, if we go back to that initial definition of a utopia, this no place, and again of dystopia, which is, again, a play on the word utopia, which appeared later, with, again, this bad place, or, again, if we think of dystopia as the opposite or the, the tension to the utopia, then it becomes maybe a way of thinking of the bad, no place. But what's important here is that to think that both of these extremes are really no places. They're places that don't exist, shouldn't exist, or even can be even argued that they can't exist. And that's, again, fitting with this thinking of futures, and again, going back to this idea of future thinking, looking at how from the present, in many cases, we're interested to look at what's probable, what's preferable within the plausible. Beyond that, there is the plausible, but then there is fantasy. And really these utopias and dystopias fall within this extreme of fantasy. And it's interesting always to think of these dualities or tensions between dystopias and utopias, and to think that, utopias are really hopeful. It's kind of a view or an interest for us to reflect on what could be the best, that state that we could be. But also in that thinking, we find that it's very didactic, very lesson driven, trying to teach us a lesson about how we live or how we should live. But in that view, it's also static. It's less dynamic or chaotic, or it takes away that chaos that's inherent in our world. And it's also this chaos that's usually a theme of dystopias, which is really plot-based and story-based. If we use Sherif's notion of storytelling that we heard in the Homo Deus book, but it's also more interactive. These dystopias are usually more dynamic, interactive, and chaotic. But also, it's important for us to think that they are the sides of the same coin. They represent two different strains of the same impulse. This impulse to think about the best and the worst, or the extreme of a situation. And it could be maybe that perhaps these utopias appeal to our intellect. It's so static, organized, while these dystopia are more, appealing to our emotions or fears or things of that way. But again, these utopias and dystopias are really born from tensions between security, freedom, chaos, conformity, static, kinetic, and so on. So it's really kind of interesting to think that they are derived from the same, source of thinking, maybe. When we talk about dystopias and utopias or in future thinking in general, and maybe compared to design thinking and thinking of how futurist thinking can help us in the design process, and specifically how utopias and dystopias could, it's always important to think of the two modes of thinking. One being more divergent, thinking of multiple possibilities, with design thinking, although iterative and reflective in its approach, still is very focused on arriving to a product, to converging to a solution. So how can all this idea of dystopias and utopias be used in design education? Well, if we go back to that loop, the design thinking loop, which is iterative, going round and round in these processes, starting by the definition of the problem, understanding of the context of the problem, the prototyping, ideating, and the testing of it, and this reflective and recursive inquiry process involved. It's a very dynamic process, but then it all starts by definition, trying to define a problem. But what happens is that in many cases, especially in design education for younger adults, we face very high level of complexity, especially when we're working in places like Egypt, where there's a lot of interconnected problems, a lot of dimensions to the issues that we're seeing, between contradictions, tensions, variety in views. It's almost in many cases as if it's unreal. There's many spaces of crisis, places of deviation, places where time appears to have stopped, like the historic locations that are interlaced with human heritage and modern activities, and in many cases, places of many rituals that intersect between culture, religion, and so on. It's almost as if we're describing Foucault's heterotopias, a collection of Foucault's heterotopias. So really, as we start to work on this design process, and we ask our students to define a problem within this complexity, it becomes increasingly hard. So they get stuck on defining the problems within these complexities, and feel that every time they try to define a part of the problem, the complexity is reduced, leading to some sort of a blockage or hurdle in the design process. So instead, we've opted in some cases to try to explore utopias, these no places, as tools for imagining places. So these pictures, some of which are taken from Old Cairo, and specifically the area of Khalifa, was the subject of one of our briefs, where we asked our students to imagine a utopia in that historic site, and engage in that utopia to create a building that reflects that state of perfection, or that helps create that state of perfection, or part of that world that they thought about. So here I'm sharing some of the ideas that our students returned to us. Here, Nuran helped us imagine a utopia of hakawi, of stories, where locals would rise to become what she called story keepers, these keepers of history, culture, human heritage, and oral histories in an engaging space where locals, visitors interact to understand, hear, and experience the built and lived heritage in different ways. And in her reflection, Nuran tells us that transitioning from what is now existent to what can be in the future was a very interesting approach to design. It allowed us to gear our focus away from the issues present and imagine how our design could potentially create a space that doesn't just solve the issues, but calls for an autonomous community that is representative of the true heritage of the place. In another reflection, Suhaila proposed a children's utopia at Al Khalifa, where children take control of their own lives, of their own education, and in fact, take control of that space and how they interact with adults and so on. And she tells us that starting by imagining a utopian world that encountered so many issues was an excellent tool to unleash our creativity and allow us to lay out what we believe is a perfect city for the community architecturally, spiritually, and physically. Finally, Alia imagined that this location became independent economically from the rest of Cairo, from the rest of Egypt, to have their own currency, to have their own central bank, and to value things in a different perspective than the rest of us. And she tells us that this imagination of a utopia was unique, and it helped us view in the context differently and think of creative typologies beyond the traditional centers of empowerments and so on, that would help bridge between human aspects and actual community problems. And of course, architecturally, that helped them explore and learn new and different approaches. So I think I'll end there for now. Over to you, Sherif.
Can you keep your presentation? I love it. Keep it up, because there's some of the slides I want to come back to, if you don't mind, especially the ones that you start describing the future, the different types of futures. It's really, you make me miss architecture, Sherif, because the graphics are amazing.
Good. I hope to have you with us in studio soon.
I'll be more than happy. I really love that the experience of being visualizing the future is amazing. Can you go back to the different, the one that's a very abstract? You have the preferable and the, because that's basically, you're confirming some of the thoughts that I was thinking of. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Here we are. This is a fantastic taxonomy of futures, which actually perfectly in line with some of the ideas that were referred to by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. I mean, obviously, the fast one would go to preferable scenarios, and the slow one, which is more deliberate, and go to the plausible scenarios. So if there is any such thing in life that exists, since we're talking about utopias and dystopias, if there is something called pragmatopias, then I guess this is where we would like to use the thinking process in becoming more deliberate and more to create a plausible one, which is very pragmatic and more realistic. And then when you go forward into your the description of the process of the problems, if you may, that you give to your students and how they came back to them, to you with some ideas. Yeah, this is a very interesting, yeah, this one, thank you. Yes, indeed, this is an amazing example. I mean, the complexity of urban Cairo is an incredibly challenging complexity. And it's very easy for a designer to fall into the trap, because being a designer myself, I've experienced how self-centered or designer-centric the process of design can be. When you're doing it with good intentions, that you want the best world to create for your clients or for the community that you're trying to help or serve, and you end up with designing something which in your eyes may be extremely utopian ideal, but it's nothing pragmatic. So the definition part of the problem, which you describe in the design process, I think it needs to be, as some of your students have done, actually extremely interactive. You know, design, it is a discovery process in which we try to understand from those people that you have in the pictures here and people living in those communities, what are their stories about what they live. You know, what are the models of life that they have. We need to understand how their life works, because so often we have seen urban designers, whether private or in government, end up designing, you know, fantastic communities or spaces for people, and that those people do not feel at ease, do not function, and they end up ghost towns or ghost neighborhoods in which people always just invest money and wait for the real estate price to go up and stay where they are because it works for them. So the idea of having in the definition of the problem being as interactive and as inquiry oriented as possible, so that you can collect the stories of those people and understand, like I said, understand their models, and therefore can come up with a pragmatic design that fits the lives of those people. Yeah, there you are, in the definition process. Thank you. That's the slide I was thinking about. Tell the ideation. The ideation should also be interactive, in my opinion. I know this is easy to say, but it is also easy to do because urban designers are by definition, or by nature rather, connected to people. They love living among people. They go to neighborhoods and they discover, because they have a very visual definition of life. So it is easy for a designer, for an urban designer, to go and interact with people and do this discovery process. So that then we can make sure that we're not biased in our thinking and don't make mistakes like some of the governments do in designing urban jungles, I call them. So that's my reaction. That's my feedback for this wonderful graphic presentation. and that really makes me miss architecture. And I will take you on your invitation. I'll come and visit you.
Would be happy to, of course. Actually, I had a question about that. I mean, the idea, one of the reasons why we had opted or explored this direction of utopias. And I mean, I shared today one example of one studio. In another instance, we're also asking them to imagine utopias and dystopias based on climate change expected in Cairo, and kind of thinking of extreme climate events that could take place, and how they can maybe repurpose some fossil fuel-based infrastructure like gas stations into resilience hubs for our city centers. But again, a lot of this thinking of utilizing utopia and dystopias as ways of addressing design was to try to help the students overcome some of the complexities or isolating problems within these complexities that they can work with. Do you think that's a good skill to have, moving from from the educational side into maybe the business or the real world?
Absolutely. There is no, and that's exactly what I meant by models of absolutely. I mean, this is something I've also learned I practiced urban planning for only 5 years of my life, but I've learned that, and I can tell you a very short story, but that's quite powerful in the learning of how you can make the lives of people better, the lives that you wish, of the people you wish to serve in an urban setting. My first job ever in my life was here in Egypt, in the Zabbalin, the garbage collection community. And there was a very famous Marie-Therese, I'm sure you've heard of her. She's a philanthropist, an extremely powerful fundraiser. So she had a lot of money at her command to use in developing communities around the world. And she came to Egypt at the time when I was working in the Zabbalin neighborhood. And being an architect, she asked me to look at their homes, to go down there and visit homes in the garbage collectors community, and find kind of like a typology, 4 or 5 models of homes that could be called typologies of layouts, and then create a model of a better home, or a design of a better home, but not to exceed 250,000 pounds. And that was in 1982. To 250 pounds, I'm sorry, 250 pounds, which struck me as extremely very, very conservative, or I don't know how to, the word, to put it politely, not generous at all. She has so much money at her command that she could easily offer 5,000 pounds for a home refurbishing for these people, each one of them. At that time, there were about 10,000 homes, so it can easily be financed by her fund. But then I discovered the lesson that she wanted to deliver to the community. And she told me, Sherif, if I give them refurbishing designs, if you give them refurbishing designs that cost 5,000, then they won't do it, because that's not going to be something that they can implement automatically, organically. But if you show, this community that you can actually change the way they live or the layout of their home to improve it a little bit with 250 pounds, any family in this community has this amount of money, and they will take ownership of the design and develop it themselves. So the lesson learned here is that here I am as a young architect who had this amazing ambition of making their life so much better, thinking that I can do it for 5,000 pounds, and then here's another lady who's so profoundly experienced and much more impactful in her thinking of understanding the model of people's life, and not thinking in my way, but rather having a narrative of their community, of this community. She distanced herself from the community and she was able to create a model that actually works for them. So the long answer to your question, Sherif, is that yes, of course, models, business model, be that business model or life models or cultural models, they're all quite important in the design process, and absolutely they have to be integrated in the design thinking of any urban planner or architect.
Okay, thanks for that. And in regards to the narratives and the biases, I mean, these are two of the ideas that you shared earlier. So I was wondering, how do you think those play into this link? I mean, working in some of the complexity of the spaces in Cairo, how do you think these play a role, and how can we maybe overcome them in some of the work that we do on the
very good. Very good question. Thank you for putting those photos up, because that's exactly what the narrative, the narrative of these people. If you ask those people, why are you living like that? Because we live in nice, clean homes, and then we go there and we find this chaos, apparent chaos, and very, very some occasionally unhealthy environments, and you wonder why is it that they accept that, and when you dig deeper, but the most important thing that you have to understand their story, their narrative of why things are the way they are, and what makes and what is the model behind it, because then if we do, then we can understand what does it take to actually create a more a plausible design, if I can mix the both design thinking and future thinking together, a more plausible design in a better for a better community to live in. And once you start discovering these narratives, that you immediately understand that some of the most complex things in their lives is the high degree of uncertainty. Most of the people that live there in the pictures that you have here, I'm sure you know that, being an architect and a planner, these homes are not formal. They are most likely not licensed. They are every couple of months or every couple of years at maximum are subject to risk of being demolished, like the one in the picture on the top left here, being demolished because the government decides that this will be an urban upgrading program, and then everything, all their life savings is gone. So they don't. When you understand that, then you also understand why the finishing is never done, why there is nothing really fundamentally stable in the way they live. They're always constantly living on the edge of having to be somewhere else or having to be dislocated and so on. And that creates a model for their life, which is expensive, I have to say. So they have to minimize costs. And when it is expensive, you don't bother to collect the garbage because it costs money to do that, and so on and so on. So I think I hope I answered the question, Sherif, because we have now to give space for our participants to join in, if you agree.
I think it would be a good idea to start the Q&A if that's possible. Off to you, Katie.
Wonderful.
Sure. Perfect. Thank you, both of you. This was a fascinating conversation. So our first question from the Q&A is from one of our participants who was very impressed by all of the books and the references in Sir Thomas More and Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And their question was actually, do you have a favorite futures thinker, either past or present, from Egypt? Or North Africa.
From Egypt. That's a very good question. I don't know. Maybe Sherif has one, but I have actually a comment, which is not a name of someone, but the comment I have is actually we are in dire needs for as many future thinkers as possible. Because I always say that without thinking, without imagination, there is no progress. And I have at least come to the conclusion that we don't have enough energy or time or resources in our lives invested in thinking about the future. And for some of the reasons I already mentioned, by the way, in the discussion with Sherif, is this high degree of uncertainty. Why would I invest in the future? You know, it's just part of the business model or the economic model of life in Egypt. Whether that be, by the way, that applies to the poor or the neighborhoods that Sherif showed us in pictures, as well as a very rich businessman who has a factory, and he or she may wonder what's going to happen next year, and should I think about the future, or should I just spend my time resources getting through and getting as much done now, and then we shall see. Hanshoof, like they say in Arabic. Hanshoof is a magical word.
Say, Goubran, do you have a favorite?
No, I don't know. I mean, I'm quite blankly honest here. I don't. I mean, I did. I haven't had the chance to go through the whole book. I mean, but I was recommended to read Utopia. It's an Egyptian novel. So
there is a novel called Utopia, an Egyptian one.
Yes. So I think Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq is the author there, and they do imagine kind of it's not really a utopia as far as I'm concerned, but it's more of a dystopian kind of future imaginary for based on extremes. So I mean, this is one thing that I've gone exposed to, but I don't have someone specific in mind, though. It's a hard question, I have to say.
You know, when it's difficult to answer a question, you can always Google.
Yes.
And I did. And I think Sherif and I are justified, because Google doesn't give me any names of future thinkers in Egypt. It actually refers to your hub, to the AUC hub, innovation hub, and then findings about things that have to do with the UNESCO program for schools. And then another AUC caravan of the future. You know, there are no names that come out on future thinkers. So.
Well, I was going to give you the hint that you could say Sherif El Diwany or Sherif Goubran, but we'll leave that for next time.
No.
So we have another question from the audience. And this, again, it's sort of related to the situation in Egypt, though I think I've noticed in the participant list, it looks like we have a number of participants from Egypt, but a few also from elsewhere, which is now more than ever, imagining the future really feels like a luxury. And it's exactly, Diwani, what you were saying before, if you're trying to just get through the day, how can you possibly focus on imagining the future? You know, with the Egyptian pound has depreciated, we're hearing talk about a looming economic crisis. I think a lot of us are thinking about the upcoming COP, which is both, it's held in Sharm el Sheikh, which is both kind of an exciting opportunity, but also just reminds us more and more of the challenges of climate change. So I wanted to ask both of you, in your opinion, what's the most effective way to convince others to focus on imagining the future in the face of overwhelming present challenges? If you had to stop someone, either maybe it's someone close to you, or maybe someone you work with professionally, if you could you had one chance, you had an elevator pitch for them, what would you say?
Sherif, you can go first this time.
Oh, okay. Well, I think, I mean, I'll resort from the experience of the two studios that I ran around this and some of the feedback that I received from the students. I mean, asking, you know, initiating the process, trying to remove yourself from the present and feeling, what I would say is almost ignoring the constraints and the realities of the present in the present situation and context in thinking is a hard task to do at the beginning. And it's something that a lot of the students that I work with as well struggle with at the start. But I think the benefit shows once you let yourself kind of delve into the process of taking a thread of ideas and moving with it, either to an extreme or any place in that cone that we saw earlier, and then understanding that, this process or linkage of events that you made in your mind, and that you're trying to respond to now are actually not that detached. It becomes part of the reality of what you're seeing. So, and again, I mean, I don't want to be too hypothetical, but I mean, in 1516, they imagined socialism, and then, I mean, it became something that people talked about 300 years later. So, and again, in a writing of what could be considered one of the very early pieces of fiction, around that genre of fiction in all cases. So all that to say is that, yes, it's hard to get disconnected from the present and think of these alternatives, whether plausible or extreme, but the benefit becomes quite clear that the solutions or ideas or responses that you have to these futures are actually a lot more relevant than you think initially they would be. So that's maybe my answer to that. I don't know if I've answered, maybe not too directly, but at least indirectly at that point.
Thanks.
My elevator pitch would be actually, it's very easy now. Had you asked me this question 3 years ago, Katie, that would not have been possible, but we have all experienced the depth of change in 2020 and how unimaginable change has happened in our lives. So my pitch would, the first question, if you always want someone to be engaged, and you have to ask a question that gives you a first yes. So you would ask, would you have imagined life to have changed as it has in 2020? Were you in 2019? Could you have imagined life, what it became in 2020? And I really doubt that someone would tell me, yes, I have. So it will always be, no, I couldn't. I could not have imagined. So that's basically to flip it around. And then I will ask then the question, well, how do you imagine life would be 5 years from now for you and for your children? And that, I think, already engages in a future thinking.
If I can also share one of my favorite convincing, I've read from multiple people, but someone said, if you're not the one, if you don't imagine your own future, someone will imagine it for you.
That's a good
And so
one.
really that if you want to create your own, that if you don't imagine the future, if you don't kind of invest in shaping the future, you will live in someone else's future, which may not be the future that you want to live in, or as you said, Diwany, kind of the future that you'd want for maybe your children or the people that you care about. I have one final question from the audience, which is kind of coming back to this idea. We talked about utopia as a way of imagining, but I actually wanted to go to dystopia because we see this a lot in especially kind of climate futures, and we see this particularly in science fiction and art and literature. So the author Rebecca Solnit, writing about this, said, people have always been good at imagining the end of the world, which is much easier to picture than the strange sidelong paths of change in a world without end. So my question is, when we are imagining future scenarios, how do we imagine kind of non-dystopic futures, kind of not the extreme disaster scenarios, while also including kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly? How do we stay grounded in our imagining, while also acknowledging that even the futures that we may want are probably going to include a lot of things that we may not like, or which may be very difficult? I think I'll let you pick, but maybe Goubran, I don't know if this is, I know you worked with Utopia with your design students. Did you also play with Dystopia, or?
Yes. So in the other studio where we work with this post-fossil fuel future, we we don't necessarily guide it to be a utopia or dystopia. In many cases, depending on the chain of thought of each student, sometimes they end up in either, and sometimes they end up somewhere in between. So we let the cone stay open for them to imagine where they want to be. So I think, again, the notion is that in all futures, there is the good and the bad and the ugly always, right? Even in utopias, I mean, these utopias, I mean, okay, to answer your question, maybe there's two parts. The first is, why do we tend to think of these dystopias in terms of the end of the world? And I think the answer is quite clear. You know, these utopias are a lot more boring, you know, like a movie or a book about a utopia. I mean, with the exception of Sir Thomas's More, you know, is not maybe something that would be too attractive, because it would be very static, very predictable, very, you know, so on, as opposed to these dystopian visions. They're a little bit more chaotic, you know. They make a good theme for action movies. But all that to say that even in students that were thinking of these utopias in real life situations, I mean, in this fossil fuel free future, for example, the utopias of you know, very connected mobility, or kind of these you know, super positive changes to their locations and their expectation. I mean, quickly, once you start to discuss with them, it's clear that there is negative portions to this. That, for example, they start to realize that, oh, okay, maybe not everyone will afford my drones, you know, or maybe not everyone will, you know. So these dimensions are always existed, but I think it's there to really require, I mean, they start to appear once you start to delve a little deeper into your future, you know, the future thinking process and the futures that you're exploring in that sense. Maybe I'll leave it there.
If I may react, Katie, as well. I think it's a very good question to be answered by the idea of fast thinking and slow thinking. You know, thinking fast and slow. When you have a dystopia, this is actually a fast thinking, especially in a context where, I mean, we live in a world which is extremely volatile and extremely uncertain, more and more speed of change, not enough time to adapt to change, social media with so much information. I mean, it's very easy to imagine a very dystopian future because of this extremely high degree of pace of change, rather, and therefore loss of control. When you don't have control, then your default would be a fast way out is, okay, it's going to go, all going to end. And we see, I'm sorry to say that, but you see around the world now how many populist leaders are just springing all over the world and getting incredible amount of following in some of the most educated societies around the world. It's simply because of that, because the fast reaction, when you have no control, then you just react intuitively, and it is not a very bright future, and therefore you follow someone who tells you everything that's, you know, been messed up by the establishment, so to speak, quote unquote, a U.S. president who was in power a few years ago, and hence the biased reaction of you know, of a fast intuitive response to a place where you have no control on the future.
Yeah. All right. And then our final question, which we always close with, which actually loops back to our first question, is for our kind of aspirational futures thinkers out there, for people who are starting on their futures thinking journey. I'll ask this of each of you, maybe Goubran, I'll start with you. What are 3 books, podcasts, articles, movies, pieces of art, etc., that you would recommend to the audience to deepen their knowledge of futures thinking? Bonus points if it touches upon imagining the future during challenging times. Goubran, let's start with you.
Okay. I mean, I'll suggest 3 books, maybe. The first is called Design Futuring by Tony Fry, Sustainability, Ethics, and New Practice. So this book kind of puts in question the process of design with the sustainability challenge or crisis that we're facing, and looking and interlacing that with ethics and the need for a new practice, like what could a new design practice look like, driven by ethics. The second is again called, it's another book. It's called The Design Way, Intentional Change in an Unpredictable World. So it's not directly a futurist thinking piece, but it kind of, again, looks at this role of design and designers and a definition of design that kind of looks at that inherent future-looking perspective or intuition in design in general. The last is Tim Ingold, The Life of Lines. I mean, it's neither design nor futures, but it's about continuity, which I think is relevant to both. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Diwany?
Yeah, of course. There is one book called AI 2041. It's authored by Kai-Fu Lee, who's a Chinese but educated and teaches in the US and right now. He's an AI specialist, but his book is actually a very fascinating read that it's actually co-authored with a fiction, with a movie fiction director from Hollywood. And they both, one talks about technologies that are already actually being used right now, and the fiction, the movie fiction director imagines and creates stories of lives in societies and people in the future, and how this technology would have changed their lives. So it's quite educational about how can technology shape the future. And then I already mentioned one which is quite important. It's written by a historian, Yuval Noah Harari, but it is definitely not about history at all. It is one about the future. It is actually pointing to some of the most powerful driver of change, and this is called Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. Well, I think I'd leave it there since we're running out of time. I think these 2 books, if people read them, they already have quite a mind thinking about the future exercise.
Perfect. And that's it. We finished right on time. At the end of today's Futures Talk, I'd like to really extend our gratitude on behalf of New Silk Roads, the AUC Innovation Hub. Everyone is here tonight. Thank you, Sherif. Thank you, Sherif. And thank you also to everyone in the audience who joined us tonight. For more information about our programs, about futures thinking, about some of our initiatives, I highly encourage members of the audience, check out our websites, our social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, for more about our programs. We'll be posting actually the series of Futures Talks that we have been hosting this past fall all together online. So there will be recordings if you'd like to watch this talk, previous talks, kind of they all fit together in dialogue. We'll be publishing those soon on our social media and YouTube channels. And that's it. So thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again at our next Futures Talk and for other activities. And have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world. And thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.